There are betrayals that come from strangers. Those hurt. Then there are betrayals that come from the people you raised with your own hands. Those leave scars no one else can see. Margaret Dawson knew the difference. At 72 years old, she had survived recessions, sleepless nights, crushing debt, and the heartbreaking loss of her husband. But nothing prepared her for the morning she walked into the boardroom of Dawson Foods, the company she and her late husband had built from a single neighborhood grocery store, and realized her own children had already decided her future. The conference room looked different that morning. The polished walnut table reflected the bright morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The walls displayed framed photographs documenting 4 decades of success. There was one picture Margaret always loved most. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside her husband, Robert, outside their very first grocery store. They were exhausted, broke, covered in dust from renovating the building themselves, but they were smiling, because they had built something together. Now, as Margaret looked around the room, she noticed something strange. That photograph was gone. In its place hung a large portrait of her eldest son, Daniel, shaking hands with investors at a recent expansion ceremony. Her heart sank. She didn't say anything. Instead, she quietly took her usual seat at the head of the table, only to find Daniel already sitting there. He didn't even stand when she entered. "Morning, Mom," he said casually. "You can sit over there today." He pointed to an empty chair near the end of the table. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then, without arguing, she picked up her notebook and moved. The room fell silent. One by one, her other children entered. Rebecca, Michael, Olivia. Not one of them met her eyes. Not one of them asked if she was okay. Margaret had spent decades teaching them that family should always come before money. Today, money had clearly won. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded neatly on the table. She had attended thousands of board meetings over the last 43 years. She knew every corner of this room, every decision that had built Dawson Foods into one of the most respected family-owned grocery chains in the state had been made within these walls. Yet for the first time, she felt like a guest. Daniel cleared his throat. "Let's begin." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You seem eager today." A few nervous chuckles echoed around the room, but Daniel didn't smile. He opened a leather folder and looked around at the board members. "We've called this special meeting to discuss the future of Dawson Foods." Margaret nodded. "I agree. The company has grown quickly these past 2 years. We should review our expansion plans." Daniel shook his head. "Actually, Mom, that's not what we're discussing." A strange silence settled over the room. Margaret noticed several board members avoiding eye contact. Even Mr. Howard Benson, the company's chief financial officer for nearly 25 years, stared down at his notes instead of looking at her. Something wasn't right. Daniel slid a thick folder across the table. "We've prepared a proposal." Margaret opened it. The title on the first page made her stomach tighten. Leadership Transition Plan. She slowly turned another page, then another. Every page carried the same message. Effective immediately. Margaret Dawson would step down as Chief Executive Officer. Her position would become honorary. Operational control would transfer to Daniel. She looked up. "So, this has already been decided," Rebecca finally spoke. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Margaret turned toward her daughter. "Harder?" Rebecca sighed. "You've worked your whole life. You deserve to rest." Michael leaned forward. "The business has changed. It's more competitive now. We need younger leadership." Margaret looked at him with quiet disbelief. "Younger leadership? The company opened 12 new stores last year. Our profits reached record highs. Our employees have never been more stable. So tell me, what exactly isn't working?" No one answered. Instead, Daniel pushed another document toward her. "It's not personal. It's business." Margaret couldn't help but smile. A sad, disappointed smile. "I've heard those words before. They usually come from people trying to justify hurting someone." The room grew uncomfortable. Several board members shifted in their chairs. Daniel remained firm. "The vote has already been scheduled." Margaret's voice stayed calm. "You scheduled a vote to remove me, without even speaking to me first?" Silence. That silence told her everything. This wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush. She slowly closed the folder. "I have one question." Daniel nodded. "Go ahead." Margaret looked at each of her children one by one. "Daniel, Rebecca, Michael, Olivia. I want each of you to answer honestly. When your father and I mortgaged our home to save this company, where were you? No one spoke. When we worked 18-hour days, who stocked shelves beside us? Silence. When suppliers refused to trust us. When creditors threatened to close us down. When I stood behind the register while carrying your youngest sister. Where were you? Olivia lowered her head. Michael stared at the table. Rebecca wiped away a tear. Only Daniel remained expressionless. Finally, he answered. We were children. Margaret nodded slowly. Exactly. You were children. So don't tell me this company became successful because you suddenly learned how to wear expensive suits. The room fell completely silent. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who supported Daniel looked uncomfortable. Daniel's jaw tightened. We appreciate everything you've done, but businesses have to evolve. Margaret leaned back in her chair. No, families do. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to teach mine the difference between ambition and greed. Her words hung heavily in the air. For just a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then Daniel looked toward the corporate secretary. I'd like to proceed with the vote. Margaret quietly removed her reading glasses and placed them on top of the folder. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She simply looked around the room one last time. The walls, the conference table, the company logo, the place where she and Robert had spent nearly half their lives building a dream. Then she whispered, almost to herself, I hope none of you ever have to learn how painful it is to be treated like a stranger in the home you built. The corporate secretary stood. The motion to appoint Daniel Dawson as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. All those in favor, one by one, hands began to rise. Even people Margaret had trusted for decades voted against her. She counted them silently. When the final hand went up, she realized she had just lost the company she had spent 43 years building. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not because she had been defeated, but because something much more painful had happened. Her own children had chosen power over family, and they had no idea their biggest surprise was still waiting for them. The room remained silent after the vote. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Even those who had supported Daniel seemed uncomfortable with how quickly everything had happened. Margaret slowly stood from her chair. For a moment, she rested her hand on the polished table. This table had witnessed thousands of decisions. Hiring the company's first employee, opening the second store, expanding into neighboring cities, surviving economic recessions, celebrating record-breaking years. Every victory, every setback, every dream she and Robert had shared. Now it had witnessed something she never imagined. Her own children voting to erase her. She picked up the small notebook she carried to every meeting. Inside were handwritten notes spanning decades, ideas, goals, quotes Robert had scribbled in the margins, plans they had made long before Dawson Foods became successful. She slipped the notebook into her handbag. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, I know this isn't easy. Margaret looked at him. No, Daniel, it isn't. He stood and walked toward her. We've arranged a generous retirement package. She couldn't help but smile. A retirement package? From my own company? Daniel hesitated. It's standard procedure. Margaret nodded slowly. I see. Rebecca stepped closer. You'll always be our mother. Margaret turned to her. I've never stopped being your mother. My question is, when did all of you stop being my children? No one answered. The silence was louder than any excuse they could have made. Margaret looked around the boardroom one final time. Then she quietly walked toward the door. Before she could reach it, the head of Human Resources hurried over. I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson. He looked embarrassed. We've been instructed to collect your company access card. The words hit everyone in the room. Several board members looked shocked. Even Michael frowned. Daniel, is that really necessary? Daniel folded his arms. It's company policy. Margaret reached into her purse. Without a word, she placed the access card into the HR manager's trembling hand. Thank you. The young man looked like he wanted to disappear. You were always kind to everyone here. Margaret smiled gently. And don't ever let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness. He lowered his head. I won't. As she stepped into the hallway, something caught her attention. Her portrait. The large oil painting that had hung in the executive corridor for nearly 20 years was gone. Only a lighter rectangle remained on the wall where it had once been. She stopped walking. A maintenance worker stood nearby, holding the framed portrait. He looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson. They told me to remove it this morning." Margaret stared at the empty wall. "So, it was planned." The man nodded quietly. "They gave the order yesterday. Yesterday, before today's meeting, before the vote, before anyone had spoken to her. They had already decided she no longer belonged." She thanked the worker and continued walking. As the elevator doors opened, employees began noticing her. One after another. Heads turned. Whispers spread across the lobby. "Is that Mrs. Dawson? Why is she carrying a box? What happened?" Within minutes, dozens of employees had gathered near the reception area. Margaret had hired many of them herself. She had attended their weddings, sent flowers when their parents passed away, visited them in the hospital, remembered their birthdays. To them, she wasn't just the CEO, she was the heart of Dawson Foods. Then Daniel walked into the lobby with the rest of the executive team. His voice echoed through the building. "Everyone, I'd like to thank Margaret Dawson for her years of service." Years of service. As if she had been an ordinary employee, not the woman who had built the company from the ground up. A painful silence settled over the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly cashier named Linda stepped forward. She had worked at Dawson Foods for 37 years. Her voice trembled. "No." Daniel frowned. "What did you say?" Linda looked him straight in the eye. "I said no. You don't get to stand there and pretend this is a celebration." The entire lobby froze. Linda turned toward Margaret. "When my husband died, you paid my mortgage for 6 months without telling anyone." Tears filled her eyes. "When my grandson needed surgery, you covered the hospital bill. You never asked for recognition. You just helped." More employees began nodding. Another worker spoke up. "You paid for my college." A warehouse supervisor added, "You visited my wife every day when she was battling cancer." Another employee whispered, "You gave me a second chance after I left prison." One by one, stories filled the lobby. Acts of kindness Margaret had never spoken about. Daniel's confident expression slowly faded. He hadn't expected this. Neither had the board. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear, not because she had lost her position, but because she realized something important. Titles can be taken away. Respect cannot. She looked at every employee gathered before her. "Thank you. Take care of each other, and never let success cost you your humanity." With those words, she picked up her small cardboard box, walked through the front doors, and disappeared into the pouring rain. Inside the building, her children believed the chapter had ended. They had no idea. The most important page of the story had not even been opened. The rain poured steadily as Margaret drove away from Dawson Foods. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Some memories were too painful to revisit. When she arrived home, she parked in the driveway and remained in the car for several minutes. The silence was overwhelming. For the first time in 43 years, she had nowhere she needed to be. No meetings, no decisions, no employees waiting outside her office. Just silence. She took a deep breath, picked up the small cardboard box from the passenger seat, and walked toward the front door. The house felt exactly as Robert had left it. His reading glasses still rested on the coffee table. His favorite armchair sat beside the fireplace. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily, filling the quiet rooms with a familiar rhythm. Margaret gently placed the box on the dining table and walked to the bookshelf. There, in a silver frame, was a photograph of her and Robert on the day they opened their very first grocery store. She smiled through her tears. "You always said success would test our family more than poverty ever could. You were right." A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away before it could fall. "I just wish you were here." Across town, the atmosphere inside Dawson Foods was completely different. Daniel stood inside the CEO's office, admiring the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He slowly lowered himself into Margaret's chair. His chair now. Rebecca walked in carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "Did it?" Daniel accepted the glass with a smile. "To a new beginning." Michael entered moments later, but unlike his siblings, he didn't look happy. "I don't think we handled that well." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Oh, not this again." Michael placed both hands on the desk. "You saw the employees. They're upset. They loved Mom." Daniel shrugged. "They'll get over it. They'll love whoever signs their paychecks." Rebecca wasn't so sure. "Maybe we should have given her more time." Daniel shook his head. If we had warned her, she'd have fought us. This was the only way. Olivia, who had remained unusually quiet all day, finally spoke. I keep thinking about something she said. Daniel looked annoyed. What now? When did all of you stop being my children? The room fell silent. For a brief moment, no one had an answer. Then Daniel dismissed it with a wave of his hand. She's emotional. In a few weeks, she'll thank us. Meanwhile, Margaret had changed into a comfortable sweater and was making herself a cup of tea when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Harold Whitmore, Robert's oldest friend, and the family's attorney for more than 35 years. Margaret answered. Hello, Harold. His voice was calm. I heard what happened. It reached me before lunch. Margaret gave a soft laugh. I suppose news travels fast. It does. A short silence followed. Then Harold asked, How are you holding up? She looked out the kitchen window. I've had better days, I imagine. He paused. Margaret, I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning. She frowned. Why? There are some documents we need to review. What documents? I'm afraid I can't discuss them over the phone. Margaret wasn't in the mood for legal paperwork. Harold, I've lost the company. What difference do a few papers make now? His voice became firmer. They make all the difference. Margaret stopped pacing. What do you mean? I promised Robert something, and it's time I kept that promise. Her heart skipped a beat. Robert? What promise? I'm sorry. I can't say anything else until tomorrow. But trust me, you're going to want to be here. Before she could ask another question, he ended the call. Margaret stared at her phone. For the first time all day, a tiny spark of curiosity replaced the heaviness in her heart. The next morning, the executive team gathered once again in the Dawson Foods boardroom. This time, the mood was celebratory. Fresh pastries lined the table. Coffee cups were filled. Daniel smiled as he reviewed plans for the company's future. First order of business. We're restructuring executive compensation. Rebecca smiled. I've already spoken to the consultants. Michael looked uncomfortable. Shouldn't we focus on reassuring employees first? Daniel ignored the suggestion. Instead, he picked up another folder. We're also selling 3 underperforming locations. Just then, the conference room phone rang. Daniel glanced at the screen. The caller ID read, Whitmore and Associates, the family lawyer. Daniel smiled. Perfect timing. This is probably the paperwork transferring everything. He pressed the speakerphone button. Good morning, Harold. The lawyer's voice filled the room. Good morning. I assume everyone is present. They are. Excellent. Harold's tone was unusually formal. Before anyone signs a single document, there's something every member of the Dawson family needs to know. The smiles around the table slowly disappeared. Daniel exchanged a puzzled look with Rebecca. What do you mean? Harold took a slow breath. Then he spoke the sentence that would change every one of their lives. Your mother never transferred control of Dawson Foods. The room fell completely silent. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. Daniel leaned closer to the speakerphone. I'm sorry. What did you just say? Harold Whitmore repeated himself, slowly and clearly. I said your mother never transferred control of Dawson Foods. Daniel laughed nervously. That's impossible. Dad owned the company. No, Harold replied. Your father and your mother built the company together. But 43 years ago, on the advice of their accountant, the controlling shares were registered solely in Margaret Dawson's name. Rebecca's face turned pale. Michael looked at Daniel. What does that mean? Harold answered before Daniel could. It means Margaret Dawson owns 51% of Dawson Foods. The room went completely still. Olivia whispered, 51%. Harold continued. Your father intentionally left the ownership structure unchanged. After his passing, your mother remained the controlling shareholder. Daniel's confident expression disappeared. There has to be a mistake. There isn't, Harold said. I've reviewed the documents personally. They're legally binding. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. We voted her out yesterday. You voted to remove her as CEO, Harold replied calmly. You did not remove her ownership. As the majority shareholder, she has the legal authority to reverse that decision. No one spoke. The celebration they had planned moments earlier evaporated. Then Harold added one final sentence. Mrs. Dawson has requested an emergency shareholders meeting this afternoon. At exactly 2 o'clock, the boardroom was full again. Only this time, Everyone stood as Margaret Dawson walked through the doors. She wasn't carrying a box. She wasn't crying. She walked in with quiet confidence. Harold placed a folder in front of every board member. The meeting is now in session. Margaret looked around the room. She recognized the fear in her children's faces. It wasn't fear of losing money. It was fear of consequences. Daniel stood. "Mom, we made a mistake." She looked at him calmly. "A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is sending an email to the wrong person. What you did was a choice." No one argued. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "We're sorry." Margaret nodded gently. "I believe you are. But you're sorry because your plan failed. Not because it was wrong." Those words cut deeper than anyone expected. Harold cleared his throat. "As majority shareholder, Mrs. Dawson has the authority to appoint a new chief executive officer." Daniel looked hopeful. "Mom, please. I can fix this." Margaret smiled sadly. "I know you could, but leadership isn't about intelligence. It's about character." She opened a small envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. "I've made my decision." Everyone held their breath. "I am appointing..." The boardroom door opened. The head of operations, Sarah Mitchell, stepped inside. Sarah looked confused. "You asked to see me?" Margaret smiled. "Yes. For 20 years you've treated every employee with respect. You've never taken credit for someone else's work. You've never forgotten where this company came from." Sarah looked stunned. "I don't understand." Margaret turned to the board. "I am appointing Sarah Mitchell as the new Chief Executive Officer of Dawson Foods." Gasps echoed around the room. Daniel shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." Margaret met his gaze. "I've never been more serious. You wanted someone who would protect this company's future. So did I." She handed Sarah the appointment letter. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted it. "I don't know what to say." Margaret smiled. "Say you'll lead with integrity." "I will. I promise." Margaret nodded. "I know." Over the next few months, Dawson Foods changed. Not because of new strategies, but because of new values. Employees felt respected again. Morale improved. Customers noticed the difference. The business continued to grow. As for Margaret's children, they remained shareholders, but they no longer controlled the company. Each of them had to earn back trust, not just with their mother, but with the people whose respect they had taken for granted. Some relationships slowly healed, others took much longer. Margaret never sought revenge. She never shouted. She never humiliated her children the way they had humiliated her. Instead, she taught them one final lesson. One evening, Daniel visited her home alone. He looked around the modest living room where his parents had dreamed of building Dawson Foods. "I'm sorry, Mom. This time, not because I lost. Because I forgot who built everything I was trying to take." Margaret poured him a cup of tea. She smiled, the same gentle smile she had worn for decades. Money can build a business. Ambition can make it grow. But only gratitude keeps it alive. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't speaking to the CEO of Dawson Foods. He was simply sitting with his mother. And that was the position he should never have forgotten.